Opening the central diagonal immediately challenges opponent's central control and prepares rapid piece development. Sicily's Sicilian defense immediately sparks a positional battle, creating unbalanced pawn structures right out of the gate. Developing the knight to f3 offers central influence and prepares kingside castling, setting a solid foundation for the game. Opening the path for the queen and bishop, this prepares a solid pawn structure, though it subtly concedes central space. Opening the center dramatically creates dynamic play, forcing immediate tactical decisions and potential pawn structure shifts. Opening the center dramatically simplifies the position, inviting swift piece development and potentially aggressive lines. Recapturing the pawn with your knight immediately contests central space and opens a clear path for development. Preparing for a queenside pawn thrust like b5 is the primary goal here, aiming to disrupt white's central control. Developing the knight to its natural outpost reinforces central influence and prepares for further piece activity. A solid defensive posture, the queen anchors the kingside and prepares for possible central expansion, keeping options open. Developing the bishop here aims to fortify the kingside and prepare for kingside castling, while also potentially eyeing the weakened dark squares on black's queenside after their early pawn push. Developing the knight to c6 offers a flexible response, supporting the d5 pawn advance and freeing the queen from its defensive duties while also preparing for potential kingside castling. Redirecting the knight to the queenside frees up the central d4 square and prepares for potential pawn expansion on the kingside. Developing the knight to its natural square prepares for castling and challenges white's central pawn structure, aiming to free black's own pieces for active participation. Developing the bishop to this square strategically prepares for castling and reinforces control over the center's critical squares, while simultaneously avoiding the immediate tactical complications that might arise from placing it on g5. Reinforcing the central pawn structure creates a solid foundation, preventing white's knight from easily infiltrating on d5 and preparing to develop the dark-squared bishop to a more active square, potentially eyeing the kingside. Emboldening the pawn chain creates immediate attacking possibilities, aiming to pry open the kingside for piece penetration and potentially launch a pawn storm on that flank. Initiating a bold queenside expansion, this pawn thrust immediately contests space and prepares to challenge white's central grip by potentially opening lines for black's pieces. Unleashing the queen to d3, white aims to ignite central activity and prepare for a kingside pawn storm while simultaneously offering a potential exchange on e6, forcing black to consider their knight's safety and potentially disrupting their pawn structure. Developing the bishop to b7 offers support for the queenside pawn push, creating potential attacking avenues down the file and on the queenside. It also prepares to contest the central dark squares should white commit to a more aggressive pawn structure. The long diagonal is now open for the bishop, adding pressure to the white king's vicinity. Initiating a bold pawn storm on the kingside, white aims to exploit the opponent's slightly underdeveloped queenside and create immediate attacking chances, though this aggressive advance also opens up the h-file for potential counterplay. Solidifying the kingside defenses and preparing for eventual kingside action, this bishop retreat tactfully avoids immediate complications while maintaining essential control over the long diagonal. Unleashing the queenside castle signals white's aggressive intentions, aiming to exploit the open lines and potential weaknesses created by black's queenside pawn push. The king's migration to safety is complete, allowing white's pieces to actively participate in the impending storm, particularly on the kingside where pawn advances are already threatening to fracture black's defenses. This dramatic relocation dramatically alters the battlefield's dynamics, transforming what might have been a quieter positional struggle into a sharp, tactical race. Diverting the knight to b4 aims to disrupt white's bishop on d3, forcing a decision about its placement or exchange, and potentially preparing for pressure on the queenside, though it leaves the c6 knight somewhat exposed if white can swiftly regroup. Unleashing a pawn storm towards the black king, this bold advance seizes more of the kingside territory, aiming to cramp black's pieces and potentially create attacking avenues. Although it does leave the f4 pawn somewhat exposed for the moment and requires careful calculation regarding the resulting pawn structure on the kingside. Black's knight repositions to d7, not simply retreating, but preparing a more active role by potentially swinging to c5 or f6, offering better central influence and preparing to contest the weakened queenside squares. Securing the king's escape route from the potential diagonal onslaught of black's bishop, this prophylactic maneuver simultaneously prepares for a potential pawn push along the a-file, aiming to seize more territory on the queenside. Embracing the open c-file signals a clear intention to contest central control and potentially leverage the queenside initiative. Sharpening the blade on the queenside, white proactively challenges black's piece development and prevents any immediate kingside expansion from black's side. Releasing the central tension and simplifying the structure, black eliminates a potentially pesky knight and exchanges material. This maneuver, while reducing the immediate complexity, opens up the possibility of solidifying the queenside further or preparing for a more direct kingside assault by white. Consider the resulting pawn formations and the open lines that might arise for both sides' remaining pieces. Unlocking the c-file tension, white decisively confronts black's piece placement after the knight's retreat, creating a dynamic pawn structure that immediately demands attention and opens new avenues for attack. The knight's journey to c5, while seeming active, redirects this piece from its initial defensive post on b4, leaving the queenside potentially more susceptible to white's growing pawn storm on the kingside. It's a bold repositioning, prioritizing direct engagement rather than reinforcing existing structures. Observe how white's king, though castled, now faces fewer immediate threats from this particular avenue, allowing for continued aggressive play along the g-file. This maneuver could be a strategic gambit, aiming to disrupt white's coordination, but it also presents a tactical quandary. Can the piece effectively support any subsequent actions without compromising its own safety or leaving key squares undefended? Unleashing the knight to d4 injects immediate dynamism, contesting the central squares and subtly hinting at future queenside expansion with the relocated knight. This redeployment seeks to capitalize on the currently uncoordinated black pieces, potentially creating avenues for an attack before black's pawn structure fully solidifies. It's a calculated risk that aims to disrupt black's developing rhythm and seize the initiative in this sharp Sicilian-Najdorf variation. Shifting the bishop to a8 presents a strategic conundrum, forcing white to reevaluate the pressure on the queenside and the vulnerability of its own castled king. This seemingly passive placement aims to connect the rooks and potentially redeploy the bishop to a more active diagonal later, all while denying white the immediate tactical opportunities that might have arisen from its central positioning. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, white immediately intensifies the pressure, seeking to pry open lines towards black's still uncastled monarch. This aggressive thrust, however, also creates potential weaknesses on the white king's own side and risks overextension if black can cleverly exploit the ensuing chaos. Black ignites a central counterthrust, aiming to dislodge the formidable white pawn chain and open lines for counterplay, fundamentally altering the positional landscape and introducing immediate tactical complexities. A deliberate retreat, the knight abandons the central outpost, possibly to reroute towards the queenside or reinforce the kingside defense. A tactical readjustment unfolds as the bishop retreats from its active post, seeking a safer haven and preparing to potentially redeploy to a more impactful diagonal, perhaps the a5-d8 line, to support the central pawn structure against white's encroaching pawn storm. Ready to unleash the rook's power on the kingside, the strategic deployment of the rhg1 aims to solidify white's attacking momentum, preparing for potential pawn storms and piece incursions down the g-file. Liberating the queen from its passive defense and repositioning it to a more active square where it can potentially support a central pawn push or assist in controlling the b-file represents a shift in black's strategic approach. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, 21. G6 aggressively challenges black's pawn structure and seeks to pry open critical lines for the white rooks, aiming to exploit the d8 bishop's potential confinement and the king's precarious central position. opening a controlled chaos, sacrificing material clarity for king's safety. Unleashing a pawn storm, white punctures black's defenses, forcing a critical choice that will redefine the central and kingside structures, potentially opening critical lines for attack while simultaneously exposing their own monarch to counterplay if black can seize the initiative. The rook's relocation to the 7th offers crucial support for the pawn and prepares to contest the open c-file, a vital artery for activity. It subtly redirects black's attention from white's kingside assault towards a more balanced, though still precarious, fight for central control and counterplay along the open file. This maneuver anticipates white's potential advance of the g-pawn and seeks to create a defensive anchor, even as the queenside remains underdeveloped. The challenge now for black is to activate the remaining pieces and prevent white from consolidating their spatial advantage. Opening the d-file is a bold, double-edged sword, aiming to destabilize black's pawn structure and potentially unlock lines towards their king, but it simultaneously weakens white's own central control and creates targets. Challenging the central pawn structure, black aims to disrupt white's advancing queenside pawns and open lines for counterplay. This capture, while seemingly straightforward, unleashes a cascade of possibilities along the open d-file and potentially creates new weaknesses in white's pawn phalanx. The consequences of this exchange will ripple through the ensuing middle game, impacting king's safety and piece activity for both sides. Liberating the d-file offers a tantalizing glimpse into the opponent's king sanctuary. A calculated risk to activate the rook, aiming to disrupt white's pawn chain and potentially create a passed pawn on the d-file. Unleashing a pawn storm, white initiates a daring pawn thrust, aiming to rip open black's kingside defenses and exploit the exposed monarch. A calculated risk unfolds as black ventures into the contested central space, aiming to dislodge the firmly entrenched knight and potentially disrupt white's pawn structure. This maneuver injects immediate dynamism, demanding a sharp response to avoid being outmaneuvered. Initiating a regrouping maneuver, the rook abandons its exposed central post, seeking refuge on the d-file's more secure rank, setting the stage for potential future exchanges or a defensive repositioning. Unlocking the f-file now offers a potent avenue for attack, though it simultaneously exposes your king to increased scrutiny. Unleashing the rook with tempo aims to dismantle black's pawn shield, opening lines towards their king, which is remarkably still in the center while white has successfully castled. This aggressive push sacrifices material indirectly, banking on the initiative to overwhelm black's disorganized defenses and exploit the exposed black king. The resulting open files and potential piece activity for white suggest a sharp, tactical continuation is imminent. A pivotal moment unfolds as black repositions their knight to f8, a strategic maneuver aimed at reinforcing the king's defenses and preparing a potential counterplay. This move acknowledges the immense pressure white's rook currently exerts on the g-file and signals a defensive consolidation rather than an immediate tactical engagement. The knight's journey back home signifies a temporary retreat, a necessary step to weather the storm of white's aggressive pawn storm and rook activity. It also opens up possibilities for the queen to potentially swing over and support the queenside if white's attack falters. The underlying idea is to survive the current onslaught and wait for an opportunity to equalize. Shifting the rook across the board aims to reinforce the kingside pressure and potentially target the uncastled monarch, creating a dynamic imbalance where white's central pawns are less of a liability. Initiating counterplay on the kingside might finally be the antidote to white's imposing pawn chain structure, forcing a reevaluation of that aggressively advanced g-pawn and the looming threats it portends. Unleashing the queen to the central attacking square, this piece repositions for a more direct confrontation, seeking to exploit the slightly exposed enemy monarch by creating potential mating nets, all while keeping an eye on potential pawn breaks. The queen's repositioning aims to exert pressure on the b-file and potentially white's king, but it allows white to solidify their queenside initiative and potentially prepare a pawn storm. Sharpening the attack along the g-file, this maneuver aims to disrupt black's king safety and create immediate threats, potentially forcing concessions or opening lines for further aggression. Accepting the sacrifice initiates a dynamic struggle where material imbalance will be a constant factor, potentially leading to thrilling complications. Reclaiming the open file with the rook immediately re-establishes pressure, a vital step after the material exchange, and forcing the black bishop to abandon its vital diagonal coverage. Unleashing a rook to the 6th rank opens up a new avenue of pressure, directly challenging white's pawn chain and aiming to exploit the awkward placement of the g-pawn. The white knight finds a very active outpost, creating immediate pressure on the black kingside and disrupting black's defensive setup. This maneuver forces a difficult decision for black regarding the knight's safety and black's overall development, potentially leading to weaknesses if not handled carefully. Unleashing a counterattack, black pivots the knight to a more active square, aiming to disrupt white's aggressive pawn push and potentially create threats against the exposed white king. Unleashing a knight sacrifice, the immediate pressure on the f-file, combined with the potential for a swift mating attack, forces black into a difficult defensive posture. White is gambling that the open lines and piece activity will overwhelm black's compromised king's safety, even at the cost of material. A desperate bid to reignite counterplay, seeking to exploit the newly opened g-file and potentially tie down white's exposed king. The repositioning of the queen to g4 aims to exploit the compromised pawn structure on black's kingside and create immediate threats against the f7 rook and potential skewers along the g-file. A precarious position arises, as the black rook on h6 now becomes a tantalizing, unprotected target, inviting white to exploit its exposed location with immediate threats. The immediate occupation of the open central file, RC2*, sets a strategic trap, aiming to exploit the compromised kingside and the potential for white's heavy pieces to converge on the black monarch. King's newfound liberty on d8, though seemingly active, abandons the central structure and allows white's rook-a-potent invasion along the open c-file. Unlocking the f-file opens a direct assault on black's now exposed monarch, while simultaneously threatening to infiltrate with the rook, creating significant harassment. A decisive exchange, simplifying the board and opening a path for the rook to become more active, potentially targeting the weakened kingside. Reclaiming the initiative with the queen's central assault opens up fresh avenues of attack on the now exposed king. A tactical crossroads. With the exchange of rooks, the kingside pawn storm has lost some of its thunder, but your king is now far from safe, exposed on the open h-file, and the knight on d4 is a potent attacking force. The monarch's position is now precariously exposed, begging for a decisive follow-up. Escaping the immediate onslaught, the king seeks refuge on the central file, a necessary concession for survival amidst the open lines and aggressive pieces. Exploiting the open c-file, the rook crashes into the enemy's back rank, directly threatening the vulnerable king and forcing a critical decision.